My name is Michael Reeves, 42 years old, born and raised in the quiet suburbs outside Portland, Oregon. For 12 long years, I worked inside the county recorder's office, the place where property lines, deeds, plats, and zoning histories are kept like sacred scriptures, the place where paper lies quietly, waiting for someone patient enough to unearth its secrets. 12 years staring at documents may sound boring to most people, but not to me, because documents don't lie. People do, and sometimes those lies come wrapped in expensive perfume, high heels, and a clipboard wearing an HOA badge. The day she walked into my life, I should have known the trouble she carried wasn't ordinary, not random, not accidental, but intentional, crafted like a legal trap. Her name was Margaret Kensington, president of the Oak Crest Homeowners Association, the kind of woman who turned neighborhood rules into weapons, violating more peace treaties than she enforced. 60 years old, silver bob cut, pearl earrings, navy blue blazer with the HOA emblem, and a voice trained to command silence. She knew how to hide coldness behind courtesy, how to smile while threatening lawsuits, how to turn the phrase "per my request" into something sharp enough to draw blood. The morning she approached me, standing on the porch of my newly inherited home, the sky was a washed-out gray, clouds hanging low, like they could sense the storm about to break. I had inherited the old Reeves property after my uncle Robert died. A simple two-bedroom house, built in the late 50s, still sitting on its original lot, untouched, unmodified, unchanged. A relic of a quieter time when people didn't weaponize property lines. I'd spent the past few days cleaning out dusty closets, sorting papers, and going through old land documents my uncle collected over the years. He was meticulous, almost obsessively. He believed property lines were sacred, and if you didn't offend them, someone eventually came to take them away. Turns out, he wasn't wrong. As I stepped out onto the porch that morning, coffee still steaming in my hand, I found Margaret standing at the foot of the steps with a clipboard pressed against her chest like a judge preparing a sentence. "Good morning, Mr. Reeves," she said. Her tone was polite. Her smile wasn't. The kind of smile that meant you're already guilty of something. "I'm just here to inform you of the consequences." That was the beginning. The moment the chain reaction lit the fuse. She handed me a thick envelope, HOA letterhead embossed seal, and several pages of printed violations. Violations against a house untouched since 1971, against a property line that hadn't moved since Eisenhower was president. The list was absurdly long. Non-compliant front mailbox, fence too close to neighbor's line, driveway edges not meeting aesthetic standards, front exterior color inconsistent with the visual cohesion guidelines, all on a house I hadn't even lived in for a full week. But Margaret's biggest weapon wasn't the list. It was the last paragraph. Mandatory professional land survey required within 30 days. Failure to comply may result in daily fines, legal enforcement, and possible property liens. A land survey, the golden bullet of the HOA world. Most homeowners panic when they receive one, because surveys don't care what you thought your property line was. Surveys expose truths. Cold, precise, undeniable. She didn't know the irony. She demanded a survey from a man who used to make a living reviewing them for a living. A man who could read plats like other people read novels. A man who knew that the moment someone insists on measuring land, they're often the one afraid of what the measurement might reveal. As I flipped through the violation packet, I studied Margaret's expression. Not arrogance, not superiority, but something stranger. Fear. But fear of what? The old Reeves property was perfectly ordinary. No renovations. No illegal extensions. No fancy upgrades threatening HOA aesthetics. The only thing unusual about the property wasn't the house. It was the land. My uncle once told me, "Michael, always pay attention when someone with power becomes obsessed with lines, because the line they want to draw isn't the real one." Inside, I drank my coffee slowly, staring at the packet on the kitchen table. Something didn't add up. HOAs didn't demand surveys lightly, because surveys cut both ways. If you're wrong, you can lose everything. So why was she so eager? I unfolded the original plat map from 1958, crisp, yellowed, drawn in ink. My uncle had annotated it with notes, distances, and tiny sketches like a man preparing for war he knew would eventually come. The official plate showed Lot 241, my lot, with clean rectangular boundaries. Lot 243, Margaret's property, sat to the right, a large two-story colonial with a fresh remodel completed just 3 years ago. 3 years ago. A remodel, new foundation work, new extensions, new measurements. My pulse tightened. I grabbed my uncle's land surveyor tape and stepped into the yard. Cold air brushed against my face as I stretched the tape across the west boundary. 1 measurement. 2. 3. Numbers don't lie. The tape doesn't lie. And what I found wasn't a minor discrepancy. It wasn't a tiny error or a small mistake in the plat. It was a full-scale trespass. Nearly 16 feet of her remodeled extension crossed into the Reeves property line. Her kitchen wall, her dining room bay window, part of her garage. The cold realization settled into my chest like ice. Margaret hadn't demanded a survey because she wanted to prove I had violations. She demanded it because she feared I would discover hers. She made the classic mistake powerful people often make. She assumed I was too ignorant to check, too new to the neighborhood to question, too intimidated to push back. She didn't know I'd spent a decade reviewing illegal constructions, boundary disputes, and fraudulent plats. I'd watched countless homeowners lose everything because someone else gambled on the assumption nobody would double-check the records. But I wasn't just another homeowner. I was the worst possible person she could have targeted. By evening, I was sitting at my uncle's old desk in the basement, the place he used as a personal war room, surrounded by boxes of documents dating back to the 60s. Property records, construction plans, amended plats, zoning maps for the entire subdivision. And buried inside his final folder was the one thing Margaret hoped would never resurface. A handwritten note from my uncle. If they ever try to corner you, measure everything. I found something wrong in 19, but they shut me out. If they push, you push back harder. The truth is buried under the remodel. Buried under the remodel. 3 years ago. The exact year she upgraded her house. She didn't just violate a setback. She built part of her dream home on someone else's land. The next morning, at precisely 9:04 a.m., I walked into the Oak Crest HOA office, a small, overly modern building with too much glass and too much self-importance for a place that handled mailbox paint colors. The receptionist looked nervous when she saw me holding the violation packet, but Margaret wasn't nervous. She sat behind her desk, cold, composed, calculating, like a queen ruling over a personal kingdom. She thought she was prepared. She thought she controlled the game. She didn't know the board she was playing on had already shifted. I placed the envelope on her desk gently, and with the calm, even voice of someone who knows exactly where the bodies are buried, I said, "Thank you for insisting on a professional survey, Mrs. Kensington. I'll be submitting my results very soon." Her smile faltered, only for a fraction of a second, but long enough for me to see the truth. She knew what she'd done, and she knew I'd found it. From that moment forward, the tone of our war was set. Not a neighborhood argument, not a petty conflict, but meticulous, high-stakes legal battle where every inch of land could decide the outcome. Because surveys don't lie, measurements don't lie, and once the truth is revealed, it becomes a weapon sharper than any HOA fine. You can learn a lot about a neighborhood by the way people look at you when you walk down the street. Some stare out of curiosity, some stare out of habit, but in Oak Crest, they stared out of fear. Fear of their HOA, fear of the woman who controlled it, fear of the consequences of being seen talking to the wrong neighbor. By the time I stepped out of the HOA building after that brief, tense confrontation with Margaret Kensington, the mood around me had shifted. Subtle, but real. Curtains moved slightly as people peeked through windows. Doors cracked open for half a second before quietly shutting again. Whispers floated across manicured lawns like the soft hiss of a brewing storm. This wasn't a neighborhood. It was a kingdom built on compliance, ruled by one woman's unchallenged authority. But that authority had sprung a leak, and the man holding the hammer to widen that crack was me. For the next 3 days, I moved quietly, purposefully, calculating every step like a chess player studying not just the next move, but the next 20. My background wasn't in construction. It wasn't in real estate. It wasn't even in legal defense, though I dabbled in it more than people knew. My experience was in records, land biology, zoning evolution, subdivision history, boundary law. I spent years watching homeowners lose property because of misplaced fences and undocumented extensions. And Margaret's remodel? It wasn't undocumented. It was over-documented. Too clean. Too perfect. Like someone had scrubbed the trail. But land doesn't forget. Soil doesn't lie. And property lines don't care about your money, your HOA title, or your social standing. They just exist. On the morning of the fourth day, I made a call that changed everything. A private surveying firm, Northline Geometrics, one of the most precise land survey companies on the West Coast. Laser-guided equipment, drone mapping, certified for legal boundary disputes. I didn't hire them to confirm I was right. I hired them to make sure Margaret couldn't claim I was wrong. Because in a fight against people like her, truth isn't enough. You need proof. Documented, certified, stamped, unshakable. They scheduled me for Friday morning. By Thursday night, word had already spread. Not officially, not publicly. But HOA kingdoms have a way of leaking secrets from inside their throne rooms. And Margaret was losing sleep. The proof sat in the small changes. HOA emails went out to all residents reminding them of boundary expectations. The maintenance crew suddenly repainted curb numbers on my street. A neighbor across the way discreetly photographed my yard from behind a bush. Margaret's silver Lexus parked outside my property not once, but 3 separate times that week. The message was clear. She felt the walls closing in. Friday morning arrived with a cold wind sweeping through the neighborhood, rattling trash lids and bending the tops of the freshly trimmed hedges. At 8:07 a.m., a white utility truck rolled up in front of my house. Northline Geometrics. 2 surveyors stepped out. Calm, focused professionals who carried themselves like men used to uncovering inconvenient truths. They introduced themselves, shook my hand, and asked permission to begin. I simply nodded. They set up their laser transit equipment at the edge of my driveway. Precise, slow, methodical. You could feel the tension spreading like smoke. Neighbors were suddenly taking morning walks they never took. Dog owners who usually stayed inside the gated dog park suddenly chose to stroll past my property. Windows that normally face away from the street were now tilted slightly open. And at exactly 8:31 a.m., right on schedule, Margaret appeared. Not in a dramatic fashion. Not yelling. Not storming out. No, her entrance was far more calculating. She walked out of her house with a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield, her shoes clicking with the confidence of someone used to demanding obedience. But confidence is a fragile thing, and fear sits beneath it like a ticking bomb. She greeted the surveyors politely, too politely, demanding to know what they were doing, requesting their permits, their licensing, their reason for being there. But this wasn't HOA jurisdiction. This wasn't an aesthetic violation. This was a private boundary survey conducted by licensed professionals. She had no authority here, yet she hovered, pacing the sidewalk like a general watching the battlefield shift out of her control. Every time the surveyors took a measurement, her eyes twitched. Every time they planted a stake into the soil, her jaw clenched. But when they began mapping the location of her remodel foundation, that's when she truly began to sweat. By noon, the surveyors had completed drone scans of both properties, mine and hers, a necessary step in cases where structures appear to overlap boundaries. The drone hovered over our roofs like an eyewitness, silent, precision-guided, unbiased. When the drone flew back to its landing pad, one of the surveyors called me aside privately. He didn't reveal the final measurement. Professional ethics prevented that until documentation was complete, but his expression told me everything I needed to know. Something was very, very wrong, and it wasn't on my side of the line. The survey will be completed in 48 hours, legally notarized, cross-verified, county-compliant. As Northline packed up their equipment, I noticed something unusual. Margaret wasn't watching the surveyors anymore. She was watching me, and there was a difference in her stare now. Not superiority, not annoyance, but something colder. Recognition. Recognition that this wasn't a fight she could win with paperwork alone. Recognition that I wasn't the compliant newcomer she assumed. Recognition that the boundary line she spent years hiding was finally about to surface. As the survey truck pulled away, she approached her mailbox, pretending to check letters. But she wasn't checking anything. She was shaking, barely noticeable, barely visible. But I saw it, and what I saw confirmed every suspicion. She knew exactly what she'd built her house on, and it wasn't her soil. The next day, Saturday, an official HOA notice appeared on my door. Not mailed, not emailed, but physically posted. The kind you post when you want the entire street to see it. It contained a list of new, urgent violations. Unsightly lawn edge deviation. Driveway border discoloration. Front yard shrub asymmetry. Potential roof discoloration inconsistent with HOA color palette. Tree height exceeding sightline harmony. Ridiculous. Laughable. Synthetic. All within 24 hours of the survey. HOA weapons are never random. They're bullets fired with intent. But the most interesting part wasn't the list. It was the addendum at the bottom. HOA strongly advises homeowners to refrain from unauthorized survey activities until reviewed by the Compliance Committee. Unauthorized survey activities. Translation: she knows the results are coming. She knows what they'll reveal, and she's trying to prediscredit them before they arrive. HOA presidents don't issue warnings like that unless they're scared. Desperately scared. By evening, 3 committee members knocked on her door. They didn't see me watching from my front window. They didn't see me listening to their muffled voices, concerned, accusing, defensive. They didn't see Margaret slamming the door after they left. Cracks were forming, small ones, hairline fractures, the kind that appear right before something structurally catastrophic collapses. Monday morning, 9:14 a.m. A Northline Geometrics truck rolled up again. One surveyor stepped out holding a sealed envelope. Certified, stamped, legal. He handed it to me with a simple nod. Professional, unemotional. But there was a hesitation, a small pause, like he knew the contents of the envelope were heavy enough to bring down a house. Literally. I walked inside my living room and sat at my uncle's old wooden desk, the same desk where he had spent decades fighting silent battles through land records and permits. I opened the envelope. The first page showed a clean, high-resolution aerial plot of both properties. 2 lots, 2 houses, 2 boundaries, and one enormous problem. Margaret's remodel extended 18.4 feet across my legally recorded property line. Not inches, not small encroachments, not minor errors. 18.4 feet, an entire room, half her kitchen, part of her dining area, and the front corner of her garage, all of it sitting squarely on my land. My breath didn't hitch. My pulse didn't quicken. I expected this. I saw it coming. But the confirmation, the official certified truth, carried a weight even I wasn't immune to. Because once truth is on paper, it becomes a weapon. A weapon no HOA president can silence. A weapon no fine, no intimidation, no neighborly pressure can erase. A weapon she handed me herself when she demanded the survey. The final page sealed her fate. Encroachment classified as significant and willful. Recommended legal action. Boundary claim, quiet title, or forced partition. Willful, not accidental, not careless. Willful, a word that sinks lawsuits. A word that breaks homeowners. A word that judges pay attention to. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the map. Not gloating, not rejoicing, just calculating, because now the game had changed. The power had shifted. The truth was mine, and truth has a way of demanding justice. At noon, I stepped outside to get my mail. Across the street, Margaret stood on her porch with a tight grip on the railing, staring at me with a look I'd only ever seen on people who suddenly realized a war they started couldn't be won. Her kingdom was built on intimidation, on fear, on silence. But now, silence wasn't on her side, anymore. It was on mine. 2 other HOA board members arrived within the hour. Whispers, raised voices, someone pointing toward her property line, someone else shaking their head. The walls of her empire were collapsing in real time, and she knew exactly who brought them down. Not with anger, not with protest, but with a tape measure, a certified survey. And the truth, every war has a moment when the enemy realizes they're losing. For Margaret Kensington, that moment came as soon as a certified survey landed in my hands. Long before she saw the numbers herself, she felt the shift. Power has a scent like iron or ozone before lightning. And the morning after the survey, the entire neighborhood smelled of it. Fear hung in the air, clinging to hedges and sidewalks like dew. And fear makes desperate people dangerous. If episode 2 was a calm before the storm, episode 3 was the sound of first thunder cracking through sky that had been pretending to stay civilized. The retaliation didn't start big. It started with whispers, small ones, the kind that come from behind windows, through cracked doors, across pristine lawns. Neighbors who once nodded politely while watering their plants suddenly pretended not to see me. Joggers crossed to the opposite sidewalk. Dog walkers tugged leashes tighter. Not because I had done something wrong, but because the queen of the HOA hive was losing control. And when a queen panics, the hive stings anything that threatens her reign. Monday morning, 6:54 a.m., a white sedan pulled into my driveway, the county's code enforcement unit. The officer stepped out with a clipboard in hand and an expression that said he had already seen too many meaningless complaints before breakfast. He walked the perimeter of my house, inspecting the lawn, the windows, the gutters. I watched him from my porch. He wasn't hostile. He wasn't even annoyed with me. He was annoyed at whoever filed the anonymous complaint. And that someone was obvious. By 7:12 a.m., he had already shaken his head at his paperwork twice. By 7:18 a.m., he told me, without telling me, that the complaint claimed my house was structurally unstable and appeared in danger of collapse. A house that had stood firm since 1958. A house that showed 0 cracks, 0 sagging, 0 rot. He closed his file and left without issuing a single citation. An hour later, a fire marshal arrived, then a county health inspector, then an environmental quality officer, for complaints in 3 hours. All anonymous, all fabricated, all sent from someone with access to HOA complaint systems. The average homeowner might panic at this point, shaken, overwhelmed, unsure whether the system is against them. Most people break under this kind of pressure. That's what HOA bullies count on. But I wasn't most people. I had spent a decade watching these tactics unfold on paper from behind a government desk. I knew every method abusive HOAs used to encourage compliance. And I knew something else. Multiple false municipal complaints form a pattern that proves harassment, a pattern admissible in court. They weren't hurting me. They were building my case. By Tuesday afternoon, the cracks inside the HOA board began to spread wider than the cracks in Margaret's conscience. 3 board members showed up at her door, this time without the confident swagger they usually carried. Their shoulders were stiff. Their eyes were sharp. Their whispers were frantic. Not the loud, proud kind of HOA unity. The quiet, fearful kind of crumbling regime. I watched them from across the street as they huddled on her porch. Her voice carried the tone of a woman fighting to keep a kingdom from slipping into sand. Sharp, hissing, barely contained. The survey had reached them. I didn't need to hear the words to know the conversation. Did you really approve an extension that crossed a boundary? Did you hide the construction deviation? Did you know the house is over the line? Is the HOA liable for this? Fear spreads fast when legal consequences enter the room. Board members who once worshipped her now pulled away. Distance, doubt, denial. The kingdom wasn't just cracking. It was beginning to split down the middle. Most battles escalate gradually. This one didn't. It jumped from petty harassment to outright criminal activity overnight. Wednesday morning, just after sunrise, the faint grinding sound of machinery tore through the stillness. A sound too heavy to be landscaping, too sharp to be maintenance. I stepped out into the cold air. 3 men, wearing construction vests with no company logo, were dismantling the old wooden fence that bordered the eastern edge of my yard. My fence, my boundary marker, the one that had stood untouched for decades. They worked quickly, urgently, as if they'd been instructed to finish before neighbors noticed. But I noticed, and it didn't take long to understand exactly what was happening. Margaret had ordered the destruction of a boundary structure, not a violation, not an enforcement action, a crime. In HOA wars, nothing screams desperation louder than a legal demolition. It's the last move of a cornered queen. They weren't taking down the fence because it violated HOA guidelines. They were taking it down because it proved where the real line was. Destroy the marker, muddy the record, confuse the boundary. This is how weak cases survive. Temporarily, the men worked fast, but not fast enough, and not smart enough, because in boundary disputes, any tampering after a certified survey becomes evidence of intentional concealment. I didn't approach them. I didn't shout. I didn't warn them. I simply documented everything. Every broken plank, every cut post, every boot print in the soil, every second captured on video. They didn't know it yet, but they were giving me exactly what I needed, proof of willful interference with land evidence. Judges don't take lightly to that. County prosecutors take it even less lightly. By the time the workers realized someone was filming, it was too late. They packed their tools and hurried off, leaving the fence half destroyed. And standing behind her curtains, staring like a ghost in a haunted house, was Margaret, her face pale, her eyes wide, her empire crumbling. When you fight a bully, you expect resistance. When you fight a bully who has committed crimes under the illusion of power, you expect collapse. The county sheriff arrived at noon, responding to the videos I submitted. His boot stepped across my lawn with the careful precision of a man who saw what he needed to see before he even saw it. He inspected the damage. He reviewed the footage. He took notes that said more than his voice did. And without hesitation, he confirmed what I already knew. The HOA had overstepped its legal authority. This wasn't regulation. This was destruction of private property, a criminal act. But something interesting happened next. The sheriff didn't knock on my door first. He walked straight to Margaret's house. Her door opened. Her voice rose, then cracked, then collapsed. The argument didn't last long. When you're caught doing something illegal, the only thing louder than your excuses is the silence afterward. I watched from my porch as the sheriff left her doorstep with a stiff, disgusted shake of his head. Something inside her house broke that day. Not glass, not furniture, but the illusion of authority she had wrapped herself in like armor. By Wednesday evening, Oak Crest felt different. The air was heavier, quieter, more cautious, like the neighborhood itself understood the gravity of what had been set in motion. This wasn't a violation dispute anymore. This was an HOA disagreement. This was a legal avalanche. And I was standing at the epicenter, tipping the first stone. In my uncle's basement office, the war room he built out of necessity, filled with land maps and zoning histories, I began my own preparations. I laid out the 1958 plat maps, the certified survey, the drone imagery, photographs of the fence destruction, records of false municipal complaints, HOA violation notices, copies of previous homeowner testimonies, documentation of her remodel year, notes from my uncle revealing his suspicion years earlier. Piece by piece, I assembled the narrative, not the emotional one, the legal one, because legal wars aren't won with anger. They're won with evidence. Evidence of boundary encroachment, evidence of HOA abuse, evidence of retaliatory harassment, evidence of illegal property damage, evidence of willful misconduct. Every sheet of paper in front of me was a weapon sharper than any blade. Margaret had made a mistake most powerful people make. She thought the law was a decoration, not a boundary. She forgot that property lines, once crossed, demand consequences. And she forgot one more thing. She demanded the survey. She triggered the investigation. She created the weapon that would be used against her. The importance of that cannot be overstated. Judges don't appreciate weaponized bureaucracy. They despise it. She turned the law into a sword. Now she would feel the edge. There comes a point in every battle when the ground beneath your feet changes. Not shifts, not tilts, changes. Sometimes it happens slowly, like the slow erosion of a cliff. Other times it happens all at once. Sudden, unavoidable, irreversible. For Oak Crest, the change began the moment the sheriff left Margaret Kensington's doorstep with disappointment shaking his head. For me, the change began the moment I stepped back into my house and closed the door, hearing the soft click echo like the ceiling of a vault. On the table behind me sat the weapon that made this entire war possible. The land survey. Cold, precise, unbiased. It didn't have emotions. It didn't have fear. It didn't care who was popular or who held power. Its only loyalty was to truth, and truth had chosen a side. My side. The next morning began not with quiet, but with the kind of calculated silence that follows heavy planning. I didn't need to search for a lawyer. I already had one in mind. There are attorneys who practice property law, and then there are attorneys who live it. Elena Hart was the second type, a boundary law specialist, a former state prosecutor, a woman with a reputation for demolishing fraudulent HOAs with the precision of a surgeon and the force of a wrecking ball. She arrived at my house with the calm presence of someone who had walked into 100 battles and walked out of all 100 unharmed. She didn't need introductions or small talk. She studied the survey. She reviewed the fence destruction evidence. She flipped through the violation notices. She made notes with controlled intensity, as if carving the story straight into stone. Her expression barely shifted, but something in her eyes hardened with each new page. HOA harassment, municipal abuse, illegal demolition, fabricated complaints, willful land theft. Her silence wasn't confusion. It was preparation. The kind of silence that means, we can win this easier than they think. When she finally closed the file, she didn't need to say anything. Everything was already decided. The legal machine had started turning, and it would not stop until someone was crushed underneath it. By noon, Elena had drafted the first shot in our legal war, a notice of encroachment and intent to pursue quiet title. Quiet title is a weapon only used when something has gone seriously wrong with property rights. It doesn't just address a dispute. It rewrites ownership permanently and irrevocably. It clarifies who owns what. It ends ambiguities forever. Homeowners fear quiet title the way generals fear losing their armies. HOAs fear it even more. Because if a judge grants it, the HOA loses control. And Margaret's entire empire was built on control. The notice was delivered professionally, quietly, legally, straight to the HOA office, and straight to her mailbox. It was the first official document ever sent to the HOA that held consequences. Real consequences. Consequences measured in square footage, legal fees, and possibly the forced demolition of half her house. For the first time since her reign began, the HOA had received paperwork it could not threaten back. And Margaret? She received a letter that had the weight of a wrecking ball. By afternoon, Oak Crest was no longer a neighborhood. It was a shaken hive. The HOA board members, 5 of them, didn't walk with the same swagger anymore. Their shoulders were tense, their pacing rapid. They huddled together in the middle of the street, like generals debating a war they no longer had the resources to fight. Some glanced toward my house, then looked away quickly. Others stared at Margaret's mansion with fear usually reserved for imminent disasters. Because now the danger wasn't me. It wasn't my camera. It wasn't the survey. The danger was the law. The danger was the truth. The danger was the fact that the HOA itself could be held liable for approving illegal construction. And liability is the one thing HOAs cannot afford. Even from across the street, I could see the cracks deepening between them. A board divided cannot stand. And a president who misled them cannot lead. They knew what was coming. They knew the court would ask questions. They knew the judge would demand documentation. And they also knew something else. Margaret didn't have it. I didn't tell the media. I didn't need to. Small towns have a way of sniffing out conflict like blood in the water, and this was no small conflict. By evening, a beat-up SUV rolled slowly down our street. A woman in jeans and a press badge stepped out, carrying a notepad and an old camera. She didn't knock on my door. She didn't need to. She wasn't here for me. She was here for the HOA. She walked straight toward the HOA office, straight toward the Queen's castle, straight toward Margaret. Curiosity wasn't driving her. Reputation was. Scandals involving HOAs, abuse, retaliation, fraud, property line theft, were golden stories. They pulled clicks, views, ratings. They expose the decay beneath cosmetic perfection. When a reporter shows up at your doorstep asking questions about a survey, your empire is already on fire. The only question now is how fast it burns. Her interview with Margaret didn't last long. Even from my living room window, I saw the stiffness in Margaret's posture, the forced smile, the strained gestures. Liars always move differently when the world begins paying attention. And just as the reporter turned away, I saw the look on Margaret's face, the look of someone watching her castle crack stone by stone. She had controlled this neighborhood for years, but she couldn't control the press. She couldn't control the law. She couldn't control the evidence. For the first time, she couldn't control the narrative. By nightfall, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. Not in the clubhouse, not in the open, in Margaret's living room. A meeting behind closed doors is never a meeting of confidence. It's a meeting of fear. Lights flicked on behind beige curtains. Shadows paced inside like caged animals. Arguments erupted in sharp bursts that carried through the thin walls of silence between houses. Hands gestured. Faces turned red. Papers were waved angrily. Blame bounced around like shrapnel. What I witnessed wasn't a board discussing strategy. It was a board deciding who to sacrifice. Margaret's voice rose above the others only once. And when it did, it carried a tone people use when trying to grab onto authority slipping through their fingers. But authority built on fear collapses the moment fear changes direction. Tonight, the board wasn't afraid of her. Tonight, they were afraid of the law. When a person is drowning, they don't swim. They claw. They thrash. They grab onto anything, even lies, hoping something will keep them afloat. Margaret began lying, not in small ways, not in subtle ways, in ways that revealed exactly how cornered she truly was. She claimed the remodel was pre-approved. The record said otherwise. She claimed the previous owner had given verbal permission. The man had passed away 10 years earlier. She claimed the boundary line might be wrong. The survey was certified. The county's GIS records matched it perfectly. She claimed I had manipulated the survey. Impossible. Surveyors are independent witnesses in the eyes of the court. She claimed the HOA didn't authorize the fence removal, but the demolition happened on her instructions with HOA contractors. Each lie was a stone thrown into deep water. Each lie sank, and as they sank, they pulled her with them. By Friday morning, everything changed. The reporter published her first article. It wasn't an expose yet, just an opening shot. A small headline, but a dangerous one. Local HOA under scrutiny after boundary dispute and property damage allegations. It spread fast. Neighbors read it. The board read it. The county staff read it. The HOA's insurance provider read it. The remodeling company read it. And Margaret? She didn't leave her house that day. Not even once. The Queen of Oak Crest, once visible everywhere, patrolling sidewalks, inspecting lawns, issuing warnings, was now hiding behind her curtains like a ghost haunting a mansion that wasn't entirely hers. The silence from her porch was louder than any argument. HOA presidents don't disappear unless something has gone terribly wrong. Something had. Her empire had begun to collapse publicly, and publicly is the one way you can undo. There is a moment in every collapsing empire when the walls don't just crack, they start to lean. And in Oak Crest, by the time the reporter's first article made its way across front porches, iPads, neighborhood Facebook groups, and group chats dripping with suburban curiosity, Margaret Kensington's walls were leaning, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. Half her walls sat on stolen land, and everyone in Oak Crest now knew it. It spread faster than any HOA newsletter she had ever mailed, faster than any violation she had ever delivered, faster than any rumor she had ever circulated. The truth had escaped her grasp, and truth, once free, became the wildfire. By sunrise, Oak Crest didn't feel like Oak Crest anymore. It felt awake. Sidewalks were emptier. Driveways were unusually silent. People who once waved at each other with routine politeness now whispered privately at the ends of driveways, glancing nervously toward Margaret's house. Some stared openly. Some pretended not to. But everyone knew the Queen was falling, and people always move away from falling structures. For years, she controlled this neighborhood with an iron clipboard and a thin smile. She controlled lawns, paint colors, porch lights, driveway cracks, even seasonal decorations. But she had never controlled the truth. And now that the truth was out, homeowners began quietly distancing themselves from her. Not out of loyalty to me, out of self-preservation. Because when an HOA president faces legal consequences, the board is next. And after the board, the community. Fear spreads like mold. Quiet, hidden at first, then everywhere. The cracks in her world deepened when 2 county vehicles rolled into the neighborhood just before noon. Plain white sedans. Clipboards. Badges on belts. They weren't here for me. They weren't here for friendly conversation. They were here for documentation. Quiet, methodical, unavoidable documentation. They inspected the destroyed fence. They photographed the ground. They measured the post holes. They collected drone footage timestamps. They reviewed the timestamps on my recordings. Everything they did carried one clear message. Retaliatory property damage is a criminal offense. Margaret watched from behind her window, barely visible through the blinds. She didn't come outside. She didn't try to explain. She didn't try to interfere. She was learning something all tyrants learn eventually. Once the law enters a battlefield, intimidation becomes useless. Desperation changes people. By the end of the week, I received a call from Northline Geometrics, the surveying firm. They weren't worried. They weren't intimidated. They were irritated. Someone had filed a complaint against them, claiming unprofessional conduct and survey tampering. A baseless complaint. Transparent. Predictable. But predictable desperation is still desperation. The county dismissed the complaint immediately, but the surveyor told me something important. This kind of complaint is filed only by people who know the facts won't go their way. That realization didn't just strengthen my case. It confirmed hers was collapsing. Every house tells a story. Most people don't know how to read a house's history. They look at walls, roofs, driveways. They don't look at permits, zoning adjustments, setback variances, historical maps, ownership chain, remodeling anomalies. But I do. I spent the next evening at my uncle's old desk, combing through records that told a story Margaret hoped no one would ever uncover. And the story was damning. When she remodeled her house 4 years earlier, she submitted a blueprint that did not match the final structure. Her extension exceeded her approved square footage. Her contractor never filed a final inspection. The HOA board signed off without verifying anything. It was all there, buried in digital files, half-completed PDFs, emails copied to no one, permits closed without signatures. It wasn't an innocent mistake. It was a fraud, intentional, calculated, covered with administrative shortcuts. And she had built that fraud partly on my property. The moment I organized the last piece of evidence, I knew the truth. The house she was defending so aggressively was built illegally from the start, and the county would have no choice but to act. When the article spread into local social media, Oak Crest fractured. Some residents defended her. The loyalists who preferred order over truth, fear over fairness. But most didn't. Because the moment homeowners realized the HOA's emperor had no clothes, they realized something else. If she could weaponize rules against me, she could do it against anyone. Small grievances from years past resurfaced. Memories of unjust fines, arbitrary citations, bias enforcement, selective punishments. People began to confess their own quiet battles with her. Letters thrown away, violations issued for petty things. Threats of liens for cosmetic imperfections. I wasn't the first victim. I was just the first one who fought back. And the neighborhood, long frozen under her authority, began to thaw. Small acts of rebellion appeared like cracks in winter ice. Trash cans left out 5 extra minutes. A mailbox painted a slightly different shade. A lawn decoration placed without permission. Cars parked an inch too close to the curb. Tiny acts of defiance. Silent, symbolic, powerful. The kingdom was rebelling. Margaret didn't just cross my boundary line by accident. Evidence now showed that during her remodel, she ignored the original survey. She bypassed the zoning setback. She altered the blueprint. She built on the larger side of her lot. She extended her garage purposefully into the unused land, and she hoped no one would ever question it. Her house wasn't just an encroachment. It was a theft, a very expensive, very calculated theft. And the law views intentional land encroachment the same way it views any other theft, a crime that demands restitution. Not fines, not apologies. Restitution measured in thousands or tens of thousands of dollars, or the forced removal of the structure. She hadn't just built a room over my line. She had built her fate. The second article dropped on Saturday. This one wasn't small. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't cautious. It was a hammer. HOA President under investigation for illegal construction and retaliatory harassment. Pictures of the destroyed fence. Satellite images of the boundary. Quotes from neighbors about past abuses. Public records showing remodeling inconsistencies. It didn't accuse her outright. It didn't need to. The facts did the accusing. And the comments section did the rest. People who once feared her were suddenly emboldened by digital distance. Anonymous accounts. Throwaway names. Courage typed into comment boxes. Some defended her. Most didn't. Public opinion is a battlefield no HOA president is trained for. Margaret stumbled onto it with no armor. On Sunday, an emergency HOA board meeting was held in the clubhouse. For the first time since I moved to Oak Crest, the blinds weren't drawn. Maybe someone forgot. Maybe someone wanted people to see. I watched through those clear windows as 5 board members sat around the table with expressions of dread, guilt, fear, and quiet fury. Papers slid back and forth. Hands trembled. Arguments erupted. Voices rose. One board member slammed a file onto the table. Another pointed toward Margaret like a prosecutor. Another pushed back on the desk as if allergic to the entire situation. Margaret sat stiffly, trying to speak, trying to salvage control, but her words barely held weight anymore. Authority isn't a crown. Authority is belief. And no one believed her anymore. It was over. Not legally, not officially, but socially. The board wasn't supporting her. The neighborhood wasn't supporting her. The county wasn't supporting her. The facts weren't supporting her. She was alone. A queen without subjects. An empire without ground. A house without legal foundation. Courtrooms are strange places. They're the only rooms in the world where truth sits beside lies, where fear sits beside confidence, where power sits beside vulnerability, all waiting for one voice to separate right from wrong. And on a gray Thursday morning, as fog rolled across the courthouse steps like a curtain rising before the final act of a play, that's where the war for Oak Crest shifted, from driveways and lawns to the cold, echoing chambers of the county courthouse. The courtroom wasn't large. It wasn't grand. It wasn't intimidating by architecture alone. Its power came from silence. The kind of silence that is weight. The kind of silence that carries a memory of every decision ever made within its walls. The kind of silence that reminds you everything that happens here becomes permanent. The morning before the hearing was calm in my house. Too calm. The kind of calm that comes when preparation ends and consequences begin. Every piece of evidence lay ready. Certified land survey, drone imagery, historical plats, permit inconsistencies, HOA retaliation letters, false complaint filings, videos of fence destruction, emails between board members, reporters published articles, the remodeling blueprint discrepancy, the county's inspection report. It took days to gather these, weeks for the truth to surface. But in court, everything would compress into a single story. A story of land, a story of power, A story of a house built on someone else's soil and someone else's silence. But I was silent no longer. The parking lot of the courthouse had seen many things. Traffic disputes, family cases, tax appeals, but had never seen Margaret Kensington like this. Not the polished HOA Queen, not the unstoppable suburban monarch, but a woman stripped of her armor. Her expensive blazer hung stiffly, like it no longer knew how to fit her. Her hair was pressed too neatly, a desperate attempt at maintaining control. Her steps were hard, sharp, nervous. Behind her followed two board members, not in solidarity, but in obligation. Her attorney walked beside her stiffly, clutching a briefcase too thin for the trouble she was in. No lawyer likes walking into a courtroom holding a weak case. And hers wasn't weak. It was broken. What I felt wasn't victory. It wasn't vengeance. It was inevitability. The kind that settles in your bones a moment truth outweighs deception. The judge entered with an air of authority that didn't need volume or theatrics. A simple presence. Calm, measured, unbending. A man who had seen enough HOA wars to know when one side was lying. Without a word spoken, the mood shifted. The courtroom became a scale. On one side, my evidence. On the other side, her excuses. The judge reviewed the file I submitted before the hearing, page by page, photograph by photograph, map by map. Each page tightened the rope around the truth. Margaret sat across the aisle from me, staring down at her hands. Not at her attorney, not at the judge, not at the board members behind her, just her hands, as if searching for the power she once held, power that had slipped through her fingers like dry sand. Courtrooms don't run on emotion. They run on evidence. And evidence has no mercy. The judge began with the survey, the certified, stamped, county-verified survey that left no shadow of doubt. 18.4 feet. A number heavier than any accusation. A number colder than any threat. A number that could tear down walls. Then came the drone footage. Then the property line overlays. Then the historical plats. Then the county inspection reports. It didn't matter how many times she blinked, shifted, or swallowed her panic. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same truth. Half her house sat on land that was never hers. Not by mistake, but by design. The judge took notes. Slowly, purposefully. Every stroke of his pen carried weight. The board members behind her shifted in their seats, uncomfortable under the light of a truth they helped create but never questioned. This wasn't just an embarrassment. This was liability. And liability spreads. When the court reviewed the fence destruction video, something changed in the room. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was a subtle tightening of the judge's jaw. A sign people don't recognize unless they watch the judge grow angry. Not screaming angry. Not obvious angry. The kind of anger reserved for those who think they can manipulate the system. Destroying boundary evidence isn't a minor HOA misstep. It's tampering. It's obstruction. It's criminal. The judge's pen paused for a moment, a long moment, before writing something down slowly. Whatever he wrote wasn't simple. Margaret's attorney leaned closer to her, whispering something urgent, something tense. She didn't respond. She didn't blink. She simply stared ahead like someone watching her empire burn down from the inside. The remodeling fraud sealed her fate. When the judge reviewed the original blueprint she submitted to the county and compared it to photos and measurements of the final structure, the truth became undeniable. Her remodel wasn't approved correctly. It wasn't inspected properly. It wasn't compliant with setback requirements. And worse, she had submitted inconsistent documents. In legal terms, that meant one thing: intentional misrepresentation. Fraud, not a mistake, not oversight, not confusion. A deliberate attempt to build more house than she legally owned, and hoped no one would ever challenge her. The judge looked up for the first time in an hour, and in that single upward glance, I saw it. Recognition. Recognition that the case wasn't just about a boundary. It wasn't just about land. It was about power abused, rules twisted, a homeowner bullied, a community misled, and a woman who thought she existed above the law. She did not. When the judge finally spoke, his words carried the weight of the room. Every sentence was deliberate. Every ruling was measured. The facts were clear. The encroachment was real. The remodel was non-compliant. The HOA retaliated illegally. The fence destruction was willful. The complaints were abusive. The evidence was overwhelming. The HOA failed in oversight. Margaret bore personal responsibility. Then came the words Oak Crest would never forget. Due to the severity of the encroachment and evidence of willful misconduct, the court orders immediate valuation and compensation assessment. It meant one simple thing. Margaret would pay, and she would pay heavily. If she couldn't pay, the court could force sale, force petition, or order partial demolition. It wasn't my decision anymore. It wasn't hers. It wasn't the HOA's. It was the court's. The kingdom had fallen. The moment the ruling was filed, it became public record. Within hours, the reporter published a feature article. Local news picked up the story. HOA watchdog forums circulated it. Real estate groups discussed it. Social media exploded with commentary. Oak Crest was no longer known for pristine lawns or quiet evenings. It was known for the biggest HOA scandal the county had seen in a decade. Neighbors watched Margaret's house the way people watch the aftermath of a hurricane. Quiet, shaken, awestruck. She had spent years ruling them with fear. Now they watched her with pity and distance. Some endings arrived quietly. Some arrived violently. But the end of Margaret Kensington's reign arrived like the final crack in a long fractured wall. Inevitable, echoing, irreversible. The courtroom had already delivered its blow. The law had already chosen its side. The truth was no longer a matter of debate. Now came the part she feared most. The consequences. For the first time in years, Oak Crest was silent. Not peaceful silent. Not restful silent. But the kind of silence that follows a lightning strike. The kind where everyone waits to see what burns. Margaret stayed inside her house for 2 days after the hearing. Her curtains stayed closed. Her porch light stayed off. Her car never left the driveway. The HOA office, once buzzing with activity, paperwork, and petty enforcement, turned into a ghost town. The board didn't meet. No violation notices were mailed. No patrols were made. No memos were delivered. For a woman who once thrived on control, silence was her enemy, because silence meant she was no longer feared, no longer followed, no longer obeyed. Silence meant her kingdom had fallen. When the judge ordered evaluation, he didn't give her weeks. He gave her 72 hours. The county sent an appraiser to her door, a calm man carrying a clipboard and a laser distance tool. He walked the perimeter of her property with steady, measured steps. He measured her front yard. He measured her garage. He measured the exact depth of the illegal extension. He measured the square footage sitting on my land. And when he finished, he delivered the numbers in a simple envelope, $148,000 worth of encroached construction, a number with the weight of a verdict, a number she could not dispute, a number she could not afford. The court gave her an ultimatum: pay the value of the land she stole, or give it up. Giving it up didn't mean returning it. It meant losing the part of her house that sat on it. It meant losing rooms, losing walls, losing stability, losing value, losing legacy. For someone who had built her identity on perfection, aesthetics, and superiority, this wasn't fine. It was destruction. On the 3rd day after the hearing, the HOA board called a meeting. Not with her. Without her. The clubhouse lit up quietly at 9 p.m., and homeowners trickled inside like citizens walking into a new world they weren't sure how to navigate. They weren't there to defend her. They weren't there to blame me. They weren't there to protect the HOA. They were there for themselves, for their property values, for their reputations, for their future. Margaret arrived late, pale, exhausted, trembling from the pressure that had finally collapsed her composure. But when she stepped inside, the room didn't shift around her like it once did. No one straightened up. No one lowered their voices. No one deferred to her. The power she once wore like a crown was gone. She walked into a kingdom that no longer recognized its queen, and the board made their decision. Immediate removal of Margaret Kensington as HOA President. Permanent banning from board participation. Internal investigation into her misconduct. Her signature was no longer required. Her approval no longer mattered. Her voice no longer held weight. She had become a citizen of a kingdom she once ruled, a kingdom that no longer wanted her. The county gave her one last chance, a final window to secure financing, pay the assessed value, and keep her house intact. Banks turned her away. Creditors passed her case along. Loan officers reviewed her public scandal and denied her. No one wanted to finance a house embroiled in legal conflict, bad press, and structural uncertainty. She applied for private loans. She contacted investors. She even approached family members. But scandals have a long shadow, and hers stretched across the entire county. On the 7th day after the hearing, the deadline expired. At 5:01 p.m., the court finalized the order, forced transfer of the encroached land from her ownership to mine, which meant one thing. Half her house no longer legally belonged to her. The living room wall, part of the garage, the dining extension, the remodeled section she boasted about for years. All of it sat on land she did not own, and now, legally, she had no right to keep any of it. The demolition crew would be scheduled next. The county would oversee it, and the footage would be public record. Somewhere in her house, a woman who once ruled everyone's lives fell to her knees under the weight of her own decisions. The night before the demolition order, Oak Crest didn't sleep. Lights flickered on in houses all up and down the street. People gathered at windows, on porches, on lawns, watching the house that had once intimidated them crumble from the inside out. Margaret's car sat in the driveway, trunk open, boxes stacked inside. Her once perfect lawn had gone unmowed for the first time in a decade. Her flowers drooped. Her porch was cluttered with things she didn't know where to place. She didn't greet anyone. She didn't shout. She didn't order. She didn't threaten. She simply moved, slowly, quietly, with the heavy steps of someone bearing the last pieces of a life that had been built on control. Her neighbors watched, not with satisfaction, but with something else. Something like pity, because no matter what she had done, no matter what consequences she deserved, she was still a human being watching her world collapse. She sat on her porch step for nearly an hour that night, not moving, not crying, not speaking, just staring at the street she once owned. The street no longer belonged to her, and neither did her house. Just after sunrise, county vehicles began to roll in. The rumble of engines echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Yellow vests moved across her property, like fate, wearing reflective gear. Officials measured, marked, calculated. The demolition wasn't the dramatic collapse of a house. It was precise, surgical, measured down to the inch. Every wall that crossed my property line was marked with red spray paint. A red line, a boundary, a truth, the same truth she had tried to bury. Residents came out quietly, lining the sidewalks. Parents held their children's hands. Retirees leaned against their fences. Everyone watched with unspoken understanding. The law wasn't punishing her. It was restoring balance. At 9:17 a.m., the first strike came. Not loud, not explosive. A clean cut through drywall. A slow separation of materials. A controlled dissection of a structure built on deceit. Piece by piece, the extension fell away. The dining room she bragged about. The garage she expanded illegally. The wall she proudly decorated. All of it came down. Not out of spite, not out of revenge, but because land remembers, and land always demands what is owed. By noon, her remaining belongings were in her car. Her house was smaller than when she woke up. Her pride was quieter. Her power was gone. She locked her front door one last time, hands trembling, eyes hollow, heart defeated. The neighbors didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. They didn't gloat. They simply watched the end of an era. She stepped into her car slowly, as if every motion weighed 10 times more than it should. And when she drove away, she didn't look back. Her kingdom had fallen. Her reputation dissolved. Her authority erased. She left behind a house missing pieces of its body, a neighborhood missing the fear she once imposed, and a legacy that would forever be remembered as a cautionary tale. Weeks later, Oak Crest felt different. Not perfect, not paradise, but free. The HOA board was restructured. New rules were written. New transparency policies introduced. New oversight installed. Homeowners began to speak openly. They decorated freely. They lived without fear of petty fines or arbitrary punishments. And me? I stood on my property one warm evening, feeling the quiet breeze move across the boundary that had once been a battleground. The land felt peaceful now, balanced, restored, not because I won, but because the truth did. In the end, this wasn't a story about an HOA. It wasn't about land, or fences, or surveys. It was about power, the kind that corrupts quietly and collapses loudly. It was about truth, the kind that hides beneath the surface and rises when it matters most. And it was about boundaries, not just lines in the soil, but lines between right and wrong. Margaret crossed both, and the moment she crossed them, her fall became inevitable. Empires don't collapse instantly. They collapse piece by piece, wall by wall, lie by lie, decision by decision, until nothing remains but the truth. This is how her kingdom ended, not with a fight, but with consequences. Because in the end, land always remembers, truth always rises, and justice always arrives, even if it takes the long way home. The end